Let's bring it right now. CNBC chief Washington correspondent and columnist for the New York Times, who's also the author of Pennsylvania Avenue, Profiles in Backroom Power, John Harwood. John, great to have you with us. You certainly were part of the NBC family, and a guy that was on Meet the Press an awful lot, and also a guy that was interviewed last by Tim Russert. Talk about Friday.
You know, it was an extraordinary hour. I walked out with my co-author, Jerry Seib, Joe, saying, boy, that was the best book interview that we've had in this several-week campaign. We've had to try to sell the thing. Tim was first of all, he'd read the book. Second of all, he was so interested not only in the characters, many of whom he had worked with. You know, Elliot Abrams was a character in our book, and during one of the breaks in the show, Tim said, you know, when I was on Moynihan's staff, I worked with Abrams. And he told stories about several other people that we mentioned in the book. And then he related the themes of, you know, what's wrong with Washington to what was going on in the 2008 campaign. And one of the things we talked about in the interview was, can it be different? And the thing that strikes me as most important about Tim, and you guys have been talking about it this morning, is the absence of cynicism, the absence of snarkiness. He loved politics, and sort of in the way that he lived it and lived his journalism, he lifted it up and made it a better thing for the country and for voters to, you know, make choices.
You know, it's so interesting, John, hearing you talk about him and the absence of cynicism. I know a couple weeks ago, you and I were talking about Bobby Kennedy as we were coming up on the 40th anniversary of his passing. Your father worked for Bobby Kennedy, and you told me your father was a reporter covered Bobby Kennedy, but said by the end of the campaign that he had problems being objective, was about to get off the campaign. And I sat there thinking, why aren't there people like that anymore that we can believe in with no cynicism, sort of jump off the cliff? And this weekend, we once again were faced with the passing of one of those men. There were so few people like Tim Russert in Washington, D.C. today, a giant that everybody wanted to follow.
Joe, I got to tell you, you know, some people asked me on Friday when we were all talking on television about Tim and the shock was still sort of fresh. Did you ever know anybody else in journalism who was as tough and as fair-minded and persistent as Tim Russert? And I did. It was my own dad. And, you know, I grew up in journalism, around sort of big-time journalism in Washington. I wasn't from Buffalo or some other place. I was from here, inside the Beltway in Washington. My dad was my hero. I lost him 7 years ago, and over the last several years, as I've moved into television, Tim Russert became a different kind of hero to me. That is to say, somebody who was the absolute best at the essence of journalism as I learned it from my dad, and that is you use this business to try to understand what the world is like, share that understanding with other people, inform the rest of the country or whoever your audience is at the time. That's the best of what we do, and that's what Tim did.
Hey, John, it's Willie. I've been watching coverage nonstop for the last 3 days. People described him as the king of Washington. Some people saying, you know, people always whisper in Washington behind people's backs. Nobody did that about Tim. Can you speak to how Tim was regarded in Washington, not only among fellow journalists, but among politicians that you covered?
Well, you know, as I've talked to people over the last couple of days, I wrote about it a little bit in my column today. You know, there are a lot of people who complain about bias in the press or snarkiness in the press or the cynicism that Joe and I were just talking about a moment ago. You didn't get that about Tim Russert. He came out of the business. He understood what politicians do. You can criticize and critique politicians and analyze them without disrespecting them, without thinking they're bad guys. You know, most people in Washington, and I say this about ideologues on the left and right, and for that matter, many of the people who work in lobbying, and, you know, lobbying has become kind of a dirty word. Most of these people, yes, they want to make a living, but they also are advocating causes that in most cases they believe in if they're elected officials. Lobbying is a little bit different because you get hired and you get sort of paid to advocate. But, I mean, most people are trying to do the right thing. I really believe that about, and in that way, Washington's no different than any other town in the country, any other state capital, any other city hall. You know, it's not a foreign place that you sometimes get gets caricatured. And if you want to know how people feel about Tim, just go outside this building. I'm sure you've been showing the pictures, but there's a pile of flowers and whiteboard, dry erase boards where people have written notes to Tim. It's a remarkable thing that's just sort of happened and kept building over the weekend.
Mark Leibovitz wrote in the New York Times yesterday about how on Friday Washington just stopped. That on trains, on the metro, and in restaurants and businesses everywhere, BlackBerries started going off, and people just sat there and stared. Talk about how official Washington responded to this and how they're trying to come to terms with it.
Well, of course, you saw every politician from the president on down, the two presidential candidates, members of Congress, putting out statements very quickly of respect and admiration for Tim. What made it so hard to believe, Joe, was Tim was such a robust guy. People talk about his joy of life. He was always smiling. He was that way in our interview. He was sort of teasing us about, how's the book selling going? And we made one of these gestures like, oh, it's okay. It's a rough business trying to sell political books. And he shouts out as we walk out the door for the last time, he says, Willie Loman, go out and sell it. And the guy just was absolutely full of life. He loved sports. We used to trade emails about ACC basketball. Luke went to Boston College. I'm a Duke guy, and we would sort of trash talk each other before Boston College Duke games. The guy was so vital. The idea that he could go so quickly at such a young age, it's still hard for me to accept that.
Yeah. The dry erase boards that people are leaving at the Bureau. Actually spoke to a group of journalists over the weekend, and we talked about that because with all the technology and information at our fingertips, we have all sorts of ways of telling stories now and sort of new and snazzy ways of presenting things. And Tim stuck to simplicity and stuck to just great storytelling, and that's exactly what people wanted from him. And I just think it's a great thing to take away as a journalist when you kind of enter this new information and new technological age, that great stories don't need a lot of dressing. And I think Tim really carried the mantle on that and so many other things, John.
Mika, he would give away those whiteboards to people who come visited him. I took my 10-year-old daughter onto the set of Meet the Press a few years ago, and he gave her a T-shirt and a hat and a whiteboard, and during one of the breaks, she drew little pictures on it, and I've got a photograph of her standing there with him holding up the whiteboard. So she had the biggest smile on her face. It was an incredible thing.
You keep that picture forever.
John, thank you for being with us. We really do appreciate it.